Now the 8 princes who accompany the 7 shepherds in ruling over the land of Nimrod are a bit harder to figure out. As I said earlier, I think that these are supposed to represent 7 spiritual authorities and 8 secular authorities, and together they form the 2 swords that Christ uses to govern his church. The church has a somewhat obvious and natural way of dividing it into 7 spiritual parts, but I don't think there's an obvious way of dividing it into 8 secular parts. Obviously, there are more than 8 Catholic countries in the world today, and historically the number of Catholic countries in the world was also typically more than 8. The difference between spiritual and secular authority is that the spiritual authority of the church came from Christ and the apostles. But secular authority existed before the church began, and in many cases, secular authorities adopted Christianity, rather than being birthed from Christianity. The different spiritual divisions of the church came from the apostles and their successors, but the different secular divisions of the church have roots that are older than Christianity. I've experimented with different lists of Christian political authorities to see if there is some natural way of forming 8, and I've only been able to figure out 2 possible combinations that have a little bit of logic in them, but I really won't put much trust that either of them are what this prophecy is speaking about. The first combination is connected with the history of the Holy Roman Empire. The Holy Roman Empire is perhaps hard to explain to modern people, since its legal existence is complicated and not at all similar to how modern states are formed. The Holy Roman Emperors, at one time at least, were supposed to be the highest political authority in all Christendom, and they supposedly had some kind of undefined role to govern the secular affairs of the church, like how the Pope governed the spiritual affairs of the church. The title of Holy Roman Emperor was gifted by the popes to different Frankish or German kings, who theoretically were meant to serve as the secular arm in service to the Pope, but in actuality frequently disobeyed the popes or even entered into conflict with them. Within medieval theology, there was an idea connected to the book of Daniel that God had given imperial authority to Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, and this authority was then transferred to Persia, then to the Greeks, then to the Romans. And the Pope, in the year 800, then transferred this authority to Charlemagne, the king of the Franks, by naming him Holy Roman Emperor. This idea has long vanished from the modern church, but it used to be an important theological idea in the Middle Ages. Although today we use the word empire to refer to all sorts of powerful countries or enterprises, in the thinking of the medieval theologians who embraced this idea, there was only ever one empire. God had gifted one country with this kind of endless dominion that stretched over peoples and nations, which was not bound by any limits, but was destined to keep spreading over the whole world, and this imperial role, which was first given to Nebuchadnezzar, had ended up in the hands of the Frankish or German kings whom the Pope named as Holy Roman Emperors. It may seem silly today, when you realize that the history of the Holy Roman Empire never came close to achieving anything like this kind of destiny. But it is not an overstatement to claim that medieval people took this idea quite seriously. The Holy Roman Emperors bestowed kingship on monarchs outside their borders. They bestowed crowns and royal insignia on foreign monarchs and gave formal recognition for the establishment of foreign dioceses. Different European factions that were in weak positions sought imperial recognition because it gave them an air of legitimacy to make political claims. In European politics, in certain ways, the emperors were looked upon as being superior to other kings and had a kind of legitimacy similar to the Pope in being leaders for all Christians. This idea of the empire's superiority, I think, is a useful concept to consider for my purpose here in trying to figure out who the 8 princes are. Because for a long period in its history, the Holy Roman Empire was controlled by 8 princes in a certain way. From the 13th century to the Peace of Westphalia in the 17th century, the Holy Roman Empire was governed by an emperor who was elected by 7 electors, who themselves served as important princes or bishops within the empire. One emperor plus 7 electors could be counted as 8 princes. And if you at least follow the idea of medieval theologians that the empire was the Christian state that had authority over all Christendom, then you could in a certain sense claim that there were then 8 princes who governed the people of God. If you're curious, the 7 electors were the archbishops of Mainz, Trier, and Cologne, all three of whom served as political leaders in the lands they controlled within the empire, as well as the King of Bohemia, the Count Palatine of the Rhine, the Duke of Saxony, and the Margrave of Brandenburg. These 7 electors had the right to choose a new emperor for several centuries of the empire's existence, at least on paper. However, I doubt that this is really what the prophecy was speaking about for 2 reasons. Firstly, the empire, while having these 7 electors for a long period, didn't have this system for its whole history or even the majority of its history. There is nothing integral about the Holy Roman Empire that said it had to have 1 emperor and 7 electors, like how it is integral for the Catholic Church to have 1 pope and 7 major branches. Secondly, the system of 7 electors was actually established to take authority away from the pope. Emperors were supposed to be approved by the pope, not by secular authorities. But the later empire established and codified this system so that they had an organized way of choosing the emperor that bypassed the pope's approval. I can't believe that God would have desired for the political authorities to circumvent the papal authority, and therefore it makes little sense to say that these 8 princes were the ones that Micah prophesied to govern the land of the Gentiles. That then brings me to my second combination to theorize the identity of the 8 princes. If we follow the idea that the 8 princes are serving as secular authorities on behalf of the church, then there's actually a very important episode in the history of secular authorities serving the church that I think makes a working combination to fit into this prophecy. In the Middle Ages, the popes called on the knights of Europe to stop fighting each other and to march to the Holy Land to fight for the Christian cause. All across Europe, there were volunteers from every country who took up the Crusader banner and went to the Holy Land, including individuals, nobles who led their own contingents, as well as kings and princes. If we were counting the countries that had soldiers who volunteered to go on crusade to the Holy Land, then that number is more than 8. Every Christian country seems to have had volunteers who went crusading to the Holy Land. But if we were only counting the countries that sent soldiers as countries, where the monarch or leader of the country actually used state resources to send his own troops to fight, then by my count, that number is exactly 8. I could be mistaken about this, because I don't know everything in European history. By my count, the following European states, acting as states, officially sent their own armies to the Holy Land. The Kingdom of France, which fought in almost all of the Crusades, and arguably had the biggest contribution of any European state to the Crusades. The Holy Roman Empire, which sent soldiers to several crusades, sometimes in huge numbers. The Norman Kingdom of Sicily, which was heavily involved in the 1st century of the Crusades, before their kingdom itself was taken over by the Holy Roman Empire at the end of the 12th century. The Kingdom of England, which was heavily involved in the 3rd Crusade. The Kingdom of Hungary, which was heavily involved in the 5th Crusade. The Republic of Venice, which contributed significant naval power to some of the Crusades in the Holy Land, but only had minor contributions of land forces. The Kingdom of Norway, which sent an army to fight in the Holy Land just after the finish of the 1st Crusade. And finally, the Kingdom of Navarre in Spain, which sent an army to fight in the Barons' Crusade in the 13th century. Now my count has some notable omissions, which I think are logical, but I'll take a moment to explain them. I'm not counting the Papal States, although it is a country too, because the leader of the Papal States was the Pope, and he has already been counted as one of the 7 shepherds, so there's no need to count him twice as one of the 8 princes. I'm also not counting the Crusader kingdoms, who obviously had their own forces fighting in the Holy Land as well. But since these were artificial creations by the European Crusaders, I think it is perhaps okay to leave them out of the list of princes. I'm also not counting Armenia, which was allied with the Crusaders and had their own soldiers at some point fighting alongside the Crusaders in the Holy Land, because during the time when Armenia had their armies fighting in the Holy Land in the 12th century, Armenia still hadn't been reconciled with Rome. In other words, you couldn't claim that they were answering the Pope's call to fight in the crusade, because they didn't accept the Pope had authority to make such a call for them. After Armenia's church was reconciled with Rome after 1198, Armenia was only an independent state for another 50 years before they become vassals of the Mongols. And at least in my survey of history, it doesn't look like the Armenian kings had armies fighting in the Holy Land during that short period. I'm also not counting minor European states that were functionally independent but legally under the authority of another state. This includes many of the minor realms of the Holy Roman Empire, like various Italian city-states or the Kingdom of Bohemia. It also includes French and Polish dukes. I am not counting these because although they may have acted as though they were self-governing states, if I were to include them, then I should probably include all of the other volunteers from across Europe who went by their own volition as well. What is really the difference between a duke who controls a large duchy with his own army versus a minor knight who controls a tiny fiefdom with a few dozen men-at-arms at his disposal, other than just a question of size? In both cases, neither is actually the highest authority, legally speaking, in the realm they lived in, hence I feel justified in excluding them from the count of 8 princes. I'm also not counting European states that sent armies to the Holy Land, but those armies never actually reached the Holy Land, such as the Kingdom of Denmark. If we include just the Catholic European states, not headed by the Pope himself, which were independent both practically and legally, and which answered the Pope call to fight in the name of Christ in the Holy Land, then by my count, there were exactly 8 of them. Now, does that mean that this is what the prophecy in Micah is referring to? I'm not sure that it is. The only thing I can conclude from it is that this was a good example of a set of 8 princes who answered in obedience to the vicar of Christ and led the people of God to conquer and subdue the Gentiles. But whether that means that something similar is true about these 8 countries, as it is for the 7 branches of the church, I think is hard to argue. All Christians belong to one of those 7 branches in the church. Even Protestants and all the denominations that have come out of the Reformation ultimately still belong to the Latin Church, no matter how they may think otherwise. But you can't really say that all Christians somehow belong to those 8 countries that answered the Pope's call to fight in the Crusades, especially considering that some of these countries don't exist anymore. But I'll take a long shot and try to make an effort to argue why these 8 countries might actually be the list in Micah. There were other crusades outside the Holy Land that included other states beyond these 8, but I don't think it is a mistake to treat the Crusades in the Holy Land as special. Recall what I referenced earlier about how medieval theologians thought that God gave worldwide secular authority to Nebuchadnezzar, and this authority was transferred from empire to empire, going down to Rome, and then transferred by the Pope to the Holy Roman Empire, such that one country in the world was above every other country and had a legitimate right from God to lay claim to secular authority over the entire world. Then think about this question. What was it that Nebuchadnezzar did which led to Daniel confirming that he had such authority and called him the King of Kings and having dominion over the whole world? Was it perhaps the fact that God gave Nebuchadnezzar the authority to take Jerusalem and the Holy Land? The Holy Land is holy because it was the land that God revealed himself in the flesh and performed the work of our salvation. It is holier than any other place in the physical universe. If God trusts you with holding secular authority over the holiest of all places, could it also mean that he trusts you with holding secular authority over the rest of the universe, since everywhere else is of lower rank than this place? If the country that holds authority from God to govern the whole world is the same as the country that fulfilled God's decree to take possession of the holiest of all places, then maybe those 8 countries that answer the Pope's call did inherit authority from God over all Christians everywhere. Like what I said when talking about the 7 shepherds, the office can still exist even if it is not recognized or known about. As long as God sees it as existing, then it exists, even if no human beings recognize its existence. Maybe when those 8 countries answer the Pope's call to fight in the Holy Land and establish secular authority over it, God also granted dominion to those 8 countries to govern the whole world, like how Nebuchadnezzar took Jerusalem, and Daniel confirmed that God had given him the whole world. What exactly would that even mean, though? Does it mean that the states that claim descent or inheritance from those 8 states then inherit this dominion? I don't think so, because there is no unbroken line of succession between the governments that ruled those 8 states in the Middle Ages and any modern state today. In order to inherit something, it has to be granted legally by the person who is leaving the inheritance. Norway, England, France, and Hungary all had usurpations, civil wars, and/or revolutions at some point between the time when they fought in the Crusades and modern history. Unless I'm mistaken, I think none of them had an unbroken lawful transfer of power between those medieval kings and modern governments. Hence, even if God granted those gifts to those earlier versions of their countries, I argue the country that exists now is not really the same country that existed then, but it is rather a new country on the same territory that was erected after a previous one was ended. Navarre, Venice, and Sicily are not states at all anymore, and the Holy Roman Empire ended in the Napoleonic Wars. Let's suppose that my far-fetched theory here is true, that God actually gave those 8th, 12th to 13th century countries a secular dominion over all Christians in the world after they did something similar to what Nebuchadnezzar had done when he was supposedly granted worldwide dominion. The office of the 8 princes was then created during the Crusades, like how the office of the 7 shepherds was created in the time of the early church when the 7 traditions were developed. But just like how the offices of the 7 shepherds are not all filled with people, and yet the office still exists, the offices of the 8 princes are all unfilled with people, and yet those offices still exist. In church history, the office of one of these 8 princes was supposedly granted by the Pope. The office of the Holy Roman Emperor could be bestowed on the one chosen by the Pope. If the Pope can declare someone as heir of the Roman Emperor, and that person is then the Emperor, could he not also declare that someone is the heir of the King of Hungary or the Doge of Venice? The heir doesn't necessarily have to have anything to do with those countries. Charlemagne really had very little to do with Rome, and yet he was declared Roman Emperor by the Pope. The Pope could declare someone as King of the French, even if he lives in the Congo. If the office exists even when it is forgotten by the world, then the Pope has the power to fill the office with whom he chooses, regardless of worldly considerations. And if I am right in my theories, then whomever the Pope puts into the office of these 8 princes will then hold the secular authority over all Christians everywhere, just like how whomever the Pope put into the office of those 7 shepherds would hold spiritual authority over all Christians everywhere. Even if people didn't respect their authority, they would still hold that authority, because God would recognize the authority even if the world didn't. And if my speculations about this are right, then maybe someday there will be people named to these 15 offices, and they will hold the 2 swords to govern the people of God throughout the whole world. But then again, maybe this prophecy means something else entirely. In conclusion, I think it is a good thing when we try to wrestle with prophecies to figure out what they mean, and to trust in faith that whatever we don't understand will be shown to us in time. But until we know all revealed truth with full certainty, we can never really be certain that we have understood what the prophecies mean. I'd love to know what your thoughts are about my interpretations in the video, whether you agree or disagree, or have alternative explanations that I haven't mentioned here. Please put them in the comments below. It is still a holy thing to sincerely seek to understand God's message, regardless of whether we correctly understand it or not.